my topic is Listenwissenschaften, of course. And the argument I want to present is really very simple, that this format is characteristic, it's the characteristic signature of Mesopotamian school curriculum and scholarship. And I will argue that in some cases, if we find Listenwissenschaften in other literatures, and I'm going to look for them today, they may well go back to Mesopotamian models. But before we look at any comparisons, it's important to make sure we know what we're looking at. So my approach is that there are three different kinds of Listenwissenschaften, which we can label as sort of horizontal, vertical, and then sequential. So let's illustrate these in turn. Now, it's well known that archaic and early dynastic word lists from the third millennium were given in a sort of tabular format. Although there's little agreement to what these word lists represent. You can see them here. Why did they exist at the very earliest stages of writings? Were they for cataloging the physical world, or were they pedagogic tools, or were they there to sort of classify objects for analogous thinking of some sort? So there's really no agreement on what these early lists represent. But what interests me are the bilingual lists, these bilingual lists, which always have a standard format. Sumerian on the left, Akkadian on the right. Incidentally, even the unilingual lists, the ones which only list Sumerian, I agree with Nick Feldhaus about this, that even unilingual lists were probably bilingual. That is, that the students within the school had to translate them orally in class. So we can't always tell just from the written record. Now, lexical lists are particularly significant. But before anything explore this idea, and before we explore this further, let's look at a second category of Listenwissenschaften, which what I would refer to as vertical. I hope you're all able to see the screen. And it's not obscured by anything. Now, the vertical lists, as you can see here, why I think it's vertical, these are often best represented by Mesopotamian omen texts, and we had some discussion of omen texts this morning, such as these Shume Izbu omens. These are for monstrous births. Now, I'm not really interested in the text so much as in the layout, the format, the physical layout of the tablet. That's what interests me this morning. Now, as you can see, each separate entry takes up only a single line of tablet. Now, that was also mentioned this morning by Pavel, And here on the obverse, the scribe has done a very good job of lining things up in a sort of tabular format. You can see on the left, with the terms, dishmunos if a woman, and utu if she gives birth. You can see how can you see how everything is neatly lined up? Here's the woman, shema if a woman is here, or bad, and then here if it's utu, if it's she gives birth. Now, and it's you can see on the right, on the reverse of the, whoops, somehow what's happening here? There we are. On the reverse of the tablet, the system begins to break down. As you can see here, the scribe tries to maintain the tabular, the scribe tries to maintain the tabular format, but what happens was it breaks down because suddenly one of the lines has a 3-line entry. And then after that, it breaks down even further. So the text doesn't allow him, but he's really tried his best. So, but even so, we can refer to these omens as Listenwissenschaften, since they're all thematically related items listed one after the other. with some kind of association between the items which are listed. So it's legitimate to call this Listenwissenschaften, even in cases where it doesn't line up so well in a tabular format. Now, we can discuss all of this later. But of course, there's a problem. How does one determine the order of this kind of list? Now, if we were given the task, we would have an easy solution. We would put everything in alphabetic order. But the problem is, how do you alphabetize if you don't have an alphabet? Now here, this introduces us to our third type of Listenwissenschaften. This is the ones where sequence is an issue. Now, for medical texts, we have less of a problem, since we can fall upon the principle of de capite ad calcem, that is, the standard head-to-foot format of nearly all ancient medical literatures. For instance, this is a lexical treatise on body parts. It's very theoretical because the body parts here don't really match up with what we find in the medical texts. But it's organized in just this fashion. Even if it's technically not a medical text, it's head to foot, as you can see if you run your eye down the list. Now, more instructive is this Ashur medical catalog, the one on the right. It's a single tablet, which has now become the subject of an entire book. Doesn't happen all that often. This is Babylonische Syrische Medizin, Band 9. This catalog organized medical treatises roughly from head to foot: cranium, eyes, ears, nosebleed, teeth, bronchia, stomach, epigastrium, kidney, anus, and hamstring of the legs. Now, this is an external frame of reference, in this case, the human body, which allows for a specific ordering of this listed data. But what happens when there's nothing to hang our hats on? For instance, have a look at this 3-column pharmacological list. Now, what is the basic principle under which this material is being organized, sequenced? Well, one can say, well, maybe it's the list of drugs on the left, where you can see you have command 2 listed in one group and then command 2 in the second group. Maybe that was crucial. Or, well, you could say maybe it's the middle column. Middle column, maybe you're organizing all of these things because of the diseases in the middle. And you can say, well, no, look at the third column. Maybe it's all organized according to the third column because you have the same kind of repeated administration of the drug, instructions for how to administer the drugs. So there is no clear argument in this case for what is the basis, clear criterion for ordering this kind of text. Now, let me just mention something which is another possibility. We have texts, for instance, which are about, like we mentioned before, gish, wood, types of wood, or household objects, or vessels in the household. Now, it may be we simply don't have the frame of reference, because it could be that the scribe who made this list was listing objects, say, in a particular room of the temple where these kinds of vessels were gathered. Well, how would we know this? We can't. We have no way of knowing what the frame of reference is, but it doesn't mean that the sequence of this material is necessarily random. There could have been an order which we simply don't have. Now, let's turn to the next question. Now that we have a sort of quick run through of Listenwissenschaften, let's consider non-Listenwissenschaften. Let's consider the opposite. Texts which record data but are not listed in separate entities, line after line. Now, this is important. Now, let's consider some of these. Here are medical recipes. They represent Listenwissenschaften because they list prescriptions one after the other in separate ruled entries, and each having its own label. So you have the label Dishna here. You can see if a man suffers from something. Now, often in these medical prescriptions, you can have other kind of rubrics listed in a very specific order, always in a very specific order, which are the various incantations and rituals that might be associated with any particular prescription. So that's all, again, examples of Wissenschaften in the way they're grouped, and the information is grouped, but it's still there clearly in a defined vertical order, I would argue. However, when you look at the bottom of the slide and you see the actual prescription itself, you notice this is not in any kind of tabular form. All the drugs are listed one after the other rather than line by line. Each drug doesn't have its own line. So the same is true of commentary texts. Now this is from Schramm's classic commentary book, and he divides his commentaries into three different distinct formats. And of course, they may be important. So on the left, you see the standard tabular format. That is an entry on the left being quoted, a word on the left, and being defined or explained with a word on the right. So this is very much similar to what we have in of course, these tabular formats of lexical texts. The second kind of format is what he calls the indentation format. You see it on the right. The word to be commented, the phrase to be commented is further to the left, and then the comment is indented, and so that you can clearly see a distinction between the phrase and the comment being given. And then the last kind of format is what he calls cola formats. That's in the background here. This is a string of word-for-word definitions giving one after the other in the same line. So it doesn't follow this tabular format at all. Now, the question is, are these all Wissenschaften? And what difference does it make? Does it make a difference in the meaning when you have these formats given in these various different layouts? Now, I think one thing we should be able to agree on, and that is these formats are not likely to be arbitrary or haphazard. They reflect in each case how the data is projected onto the tablet. The clearest representations appear to be the tabular formats, which you have here on the left, in which each entry on the left side of the column is clearly delineated. Often you can see by a ruling. It's delineated from the right explanatory data on the right side of the column, or in a column of its own. Now, this fact is significant. So because it focuses our attention on data which consists of two separate categories, which we might call protasis and apodosis, which Pavel also mentioned this morning in reference to omens. This is basically a topic on the left and an explanatory word or phrase on the right. And this probably reflects scribal training in the ancient school curriculum rather than any whimsical preference for a scribe. I don't know of cases where it ever occurs the other way around. So it's a very standard format. Now, let me try to explain why I think this could be interesting. While I was searching for Wissenschaften formats in second and first millennium tablets, I came across something which I really didn't expect. And this is in Ugarit. Now, we had Ugarit also mentioned earlier today. Oops. I'm trying, here we are. Let's see if I can. Now, we can find double column tablets from Ugarit, but these are from the city of Ugarit. These are usually Sumerian Akkadian texts known from other centers, or even with lexical texts that include Hurrian. But I haven't yet found a single example of a double column tabular format, tabular exemplar of Wissenschaften among the alphabetic texts from Ugarit. Now, I'm willing to be corrected on this, but notice on the slide here how all the data is listed in a continuous line of text, not in line after line listing. And you can see the translation on the right shows you that they could have these are all for sacrifices for a ritual. They could have all been listed in kind of tabular format, but they're not. Now, why is that? And there may be two reasons for this. First, alphabetic texts tend to be unilingual Ugaritic rather than bilingual. And it may be that these Listenwissenschaften was simply not a curriculum convention of scribes learning to write in alphabetic characters. So these are two things, that the alphabetic texts being unilingual, they don't need to have two columns, one for necessarily Ugaritic and one for another language. Although it is true that in lexical texts from Ugarit, you can find a column of Ugaritic, but they're always transliterated into Akkadian cuneiform. So I'm talking about texts in alphabetic script and in Ugaritic language. So it may be that what we call Listenwissenschaften from Mesopotamia and Anatolia generally reflects a feature of cuneiform writing associated with Sumerian and Akkadian, as well as in Hittite school contexts. So let's step back and consider the situation and ask ourselves a key question. What other neighboring societies in the ancient Near East, which did not use cuneiform writing, had such a fond attachment to Listenwissenschaften? Egyptians, for instance. They did not enjoy the kind of Sprachbund which existed between Sumerian and Akkadian, which was an integral part of Mesopotamian episteme. There was no second language in the Egyptian schools or in the curriculum. There's no comparable lexical tradition or even an Omen literature in Egypt comparable to Mesopotamia or Anatolia. The Hebrews of the Bible, they had their own literary masterpieces, but no surviving school tradition of lexicography, even though they developed a bilingual curriculum based on Aramaic, which coincidentally never happened in Mesopotamia. We don't ever have a column of Aramaic in our lexical texts. And there's really no evidence for Omen literature in the Bible, apart from an interest in dreams. Now, the Canaanite world is interesting, again back to Ugarit, because one example of celestial omens does appear in Ugaritic language in alphabetic script, which is enough to suggest that there was a certain interest in certain forms of Listenwissenschaften, of course, the kind which we call vertical. We can see them here. If. This is pretty much what Pavel also noted this morning. Now, there's a second example of Shomeizbu omens in Ugaritic. It's also of interest. But note how the layout of both the Ugaritic tablets, neither of them shows any indication of a division between protasis and apodosis, as we have seen in other examples of the Akkadian omens. So this is important, that there's no tabular formats here. Oh, sorry. Right. In the main, I did find it there are also, even in Hittite contexts. I haven't made an exhaustive survey, but I haven't really found tabular formats in Hittite contexts as well. So in the main, Akkadian appears to be the dominant preserve of Listenwissenschaften among ancient languages in the region, with a predilection towards tabular formatting of the data, even within the vertical Listenwissenschaften of omens. So the question is, why lists in tabular formats are so well attested in Mesopotamian tradition, including Anatolia, but really nowhere else in the ancient Near East to nearly the same extent. So the obvious question, in order to approach this problem, is whether the Greeks had anything like Listenwissenschaften, and if they did, if they had this, where did it come from? Now, it may seem obvious that ancient Greeks had a very different approach to science, since they didn't have the burden of 2,000 years of Oppenheim's famous stream of tradition resting on their shoulders. Greeks were free to invent new terminology and new concepts, such as physos for an abstract concept of nature, which Francesca Brochberg has clearly demonstrated was not a Babylonian idea. Now, one colleague, Mark van der Meerup from Columbia University, has recently been defending his idea of some sort of pre-Hellenic Akkadian brand of philosophy, mostly based on examples of Listenwissenschaften. His data is mostly Listenwissenschaften, which he wants to define as philosophy. Now, let's be clear about this. Philosophy was a Greek invention, a literary genre based upon tractates or arguments clearly identified with a specific thinker or writer to whom these ideas and arguments were attributed. So Plato said, Aristotle said, Galen said, etc. This is very different from the anonymous Listenwissenschaften tradition of Mesopotamia. And to use the label of philosophy for Mesopotamia, in my view, is simply not correct. Now, there's more to this, however. Several years ago, my colleague Cale Johnson and I held a joint seminar at the Max Planck Institute for Wissenschaftsgeschichte, together with the eminent classicist Glenn Most. And the topic was lexicon and commentary. Now, Glenn Most presented his case, which he clearly assumed to cover the entire ancient world in general, at least the Western world. The Greeks first developed a commentary tradition, and then they wrote the lexicon. But he was quite surprised when Cale Johnson provided a completely different picture from Mesopotamia of an extensive lexical tradition preceding the commentaries and often forming the basis for the commentaries. And by the end of the morning, it became obvious that these Greek episteme had a completely different starting point from that of Mesopotamia. Now, this brings us back to this central question. Did the Greeks have Listenwissenschaften? Now, it turns out they did, in limited ways. So, Glenn most recently sent me his most recent article on catalogs in Greek tradition. And this begins with Homer's famous catalog of ships and Hesiod's catalog of women. Now, this looks like Listenwissenschaften. Huh? Although having certain attributes of lists, the list-like, these are poetic compositions. And Glenn Most explains that these catalogs are intended to provide a narrative based on proper names, but as such, they have little in common with their Akkadian lists. But he goes on, however, to describe these lists or catalogs among early pre-Socratic philosophers, such as Empedocles. So while Glenn Most demonstrates no awareness of Mesopotamian Listenwissenschaften in this article, he discusses new discursive forms among early Greek philosophers who use common nouns designating material objects. Most sees these lists as developments from earlier catalogs in Greek epic poetry, used in an argument rather than to be the object of admiration in its own right. You can see I've quoted here most comments on the screen. It seems clear to me that this description of Greek catalogs could easily apply to Mesopotamian Wissenschaften in many respects. And it's very likely that these pre-Socratic philosophers were influenced by an episteme which was much older than either Homer or Hesiod. Now, let's turn our attention to my favorite Greek author, the anonymous author of the Hippocratic treatise on the sacred disease. Now, in one passage, we find a list of propositions, all beginning with if. I've circled slides. introducing symptoms which have been attributed to the influence of various gods. Now you can see the text here. If the patient imitates a goat, if he roars, suffers convulsions, etc., what it's because they say, it's typical commentary talk, that the mother of the gods is to blame. If he passes excrement, yes, then the name is of Onodia is applied, so she's to blame. If the excrement is frequent and thinner, then it's from Apollo. If he foams at the mouth and kicks, then it's going to be Ares. If at night, etc., he has delirium, jumps from his bed, etc., it's Hecate. Now, this looks very much like Wissenschaft in Greek, but it's not cited as an example of Greek medicine. It's an example of pre-Hippocratic medicine from an earlier period or from a foreign source which Hippocratic medicine intends to correct. So this is given as an example of non-Greek medicine. Now, what I'd like you to do is to compare this passage with the Akkadian Diagnostic Handbook. You can see it on the slide here. So at the bottom, you see you have the hand of Azu. If he's injured, right, he has the hand of the twin gods, hand of Adad, hand of Ea, hand of Papsukal. You can just run your eye. I don't have to read all these out to you, but you can just see from these examples, if his temples shake and his sweat rolls, etc., it's the hand of Ishtar or Shamash. These are all typical of passages. I've just taken them at random from the Babylonian Diagnostic Handbook, which is a list of some several thousand symptoms. But this typical idea there is the hand of. Now, what I'd like you to do is to go back to the same passage in Greek, and instead of just mentioning the name of the gods, I would put hand of the gods into, imagine this in this original form of the passage. Hand of the mother of the gods, hand of Poseidon, hand of Enodia, hand of Apollo, hand of Ares. If you do this, you begin to see that these passages begin to look very similar. Now, there's even more to it than that, because if you look at the passages themselves, some of the specifics in the passage in the Sacred Disease looks similar to specific references in the Diagnostic Handbook. For instance, the person is compared to a horse, or that the cry of a goat. And even the gods, Enodia and heroes, I think we hear, yes, Enodia is the guardian to the entrance of the cities. This is very much like the reference to the hand of a city god. And the heroes are very much like the frequent references to the hand of the ghosts, which we get in the Diagnostic Handbook. So this is a passage where I think deserves much more study. Really much more study, more in-depth study, but it looks very much like an example of a Greek citation in the Sacred Disease, which was aware of the characteristic phraseology of the Akkadian Diagnostic Handbook, including its Listenwissenschaften formats. Now, just give you one more example. This is the final point about Listenwissenschaften, which is equally challenging to the usual view of science as being separate and compartmentalized within each language and society. Now, what I'm proposing is that the Akkadian Listenwissenschaften was not only the hallmark of Babylonian episteme, but it also influenced later curricula in languages and literatures. Now, for this, we have to jump forward in time to late antiquity, to the Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud, to see if signs of Akkadian-like Listenwissenschaften may have left its mark on the text. That Akkadian influenced Aramaic is based on my assumption that Akkadians survived longer than we suspect. There are two datable astronomical almanacs from the late 1st century CE, dating around 80 CE, both of them. One from Babylon and one from Uruk. These can hardly represent the end of cuneiform writing. His two scribes from Uruk and Babylon were hardly likely to have been the last people on earth who would have been writing in cuneiform, and not copying, but composing tablets. And also, why would they write tablets if no one was able to read them? Usually you write something because you expect someone would be able to read it. So I think that the idea that cuneiform could have been surviving for another couple of hundred years is very plausible. Now, the second assumption is that Akkadian curriculum dominated Babylonian schooling. I'm talking about Mesopotamian schooling, the geographical area, for many centuries, and it established the models for hermeneutics, which was later followed in Aramaic schooling. That is best illustrated in the Babylonian Talmud, which from approximately the 3rd century CE. So this Babylonian Akkadian curriculum established norms, which was later followed in the Aramaic and Syriac, certain centers. Now, we could, instead of going through this bottomless pit of the Babylonian Talmud, I'm going to concentrate on a text attributed to one particular scholar from the 3rd and early 4th century named Abaya. Now, he had serious interest in medicine, since the Talmud records no less than 24 different medical and magical recipes attributed to him. And each one begins with a formulaic statement, and Imanu told this to him, an expert, Uman, Aramaic Uman corresponding to Akkadian Umanu for the expert. Umanu is the senior title for the professor in the Babylonian schools. Now, if you read the translations of the Talmud in either English or German, you'll find that they claim that his mother told him this. Although the Talmud mentions that his mother died in childbirth. This is a formulaic statement which has been badly misunderstood in all translations. The word is an apocryphated form of umanu, which has been misunderstood as the word for mother. Now, I've surveyed all of the recipes from this abaya, and I found Akkadian loanwords and calques in almost every case. And in my view, this abaya must have had some knowledge of Akkadian, because he tells a joke, which can only be understood as an Akkadian pun. Well, here's the joke. He says, an expert said to me, of course, my mother is what the usual translation is. The expert told this to me, that eating dates before bread, which is a meal, is like taking an axe to a date palm, but after a meal is like a door bolt. Now, no commentator has ever successfully explained this humorous aphorism from Abaya. The reason is they're unaware of the Akkadian pun which is behind it. So in my view, this puzzling statement can only be understood if one knows that the Akkadian word aru has 3 homonyms. One refers to the date palm frond, aru. The other refers to cutting the branches of the date palm. This is the bias taking the axe to the date palm. And finally, the word for vomiting, aru, which explains why one shouldn't eat dates on an empty stomach, because he'll get nauseous. After the meal, however, the danger is constipation, since the door bolt is an allusion to the Akkadian expression bab shuburi, the door of the rectum, which causes constipation when shut, as we know from Akkadian recipes. Now, since we've now at least partially established some possible credentials for Abaya, that he either knew some Akkadian or knew someone who knew Akkadian, let's look at one of his interesting statements. Now, you notice the statement itself, as we'll see, is just in a paragraph form, but it turns out to be an interesting case of Listenwissenschaften, because each statement begins with the same expression. Abaya said, formerly I used to say that. And then the expression comes, my master told me it is because of something. Now this reason for my master is the other reason why I believe that this umanu is not his mother, but it really is an umami. It's an expert. Now, in each case, it's interesting because Abaya thinks that practices reflect etiquette or good manners, and the master tells him, no, it's really something much more serious than that. It usually has to do with either demons or disease. And what's interesting is that in several cases, several of these cases, there are Akkadian cognates and even loan words that are referred to by this master. We can find them. For instance, he said, nothing in the second instance, nothing is removed from the table when a person holds a cup to drink, lest an embarrassment happen at the meal. The master said, no, it's not that. It is because of the Tsadaru disease, which can be affected by Tsadaru disease, which we know from Akkadian. So just to show you that there's enough information here to make us suspect that there is an Akkadian background to this information, and that it is really an example of Listenwissenschaften. Now, why isn't it listed in listed form? If it's Listenwissenschaften, why doesn't it reflect the line for line kind of tabular formats that we know from Listenwissenschaften, or even the vertical formats that we know that we will be able to recognize, indented formats? It's because these texts were edited 3 or 4 centuries later in a completely different era of Byzantium. And they had no idea at that point, when the texts were edited together, about Akkadian or Listenwissenschaften or Babylonian learning. And it's lucky that they preserved these texts as they did, although the formats are lost. But we can reconstruct it. We can through the repetitions, we should be able to reconstruct it. And I just have one more example before I stop. This is another Abaya text, and this really looks like Listenwissenschaften, the kind of things we see from Mesopotamia, even though, as you can see in the Hebrew text below, that the format doesn't reflect it. Now, Abaya is commenting on a Hebrew text, and the Hebrew text says, leather, fish, a cup of hot liquid, whatever that is, eggs and white lice, these are all harmful for the other thing. The other thing is a euphemism for leprosy. And then, this is a nice bilingual text because each of the Hebrew expressions is now explained in Aramaic. This is very much similar to the way Sumerian is being, in commentaries, would be explained in Akkadian. Sumerian word would be explained in Akkadian in a commentary. So you can see one of my interesting ones is the case of leather. Why is leather dangerous? It's one who lies down on an animal hide. Now this is interesting because it's likely to reflect Akkadian salu being a sleeping person, and the mashak sali is the term for tanned leather. Or the fish, shibuta fish, could be a pun on Akkadian shibtu, plague. So as you can see, again, Akkadian underlying in the background here, underlying influence in a kind of typical tabular format that we know from Akkadian. I just want to end with one thing, just one more little thing. I'm not going to put another text, and I just want to say, just to take stock of what we've seen, Listenwissenschaften is the key format for virtually all of Babylonian Wissenschaften. This includes a sort of if P, then Q formats of law codes and omens, which we also discussed this morning. This if so and so, then something happens and something else happens. This, as well as the double column tabular for layouts of lexical texts and commentaries, which spill over into other genres as well. Now, unlike Greek philosophers, Babylonian scholars didn't compose explanatory essays expressing their ideas or opinions on the natural or social world, but the data was collected in linear fashion, either horizontal or vertical. Now, not all Sumerian or Akkadian literary genres take this Listenwissenschaften format, since literary texts, incantations, medical prescriptions, prayers, letters, these all adopt other stylistic conventions. What's striking is the conservative nature of Mesopotamian scribal craft, which virtually never deviated from the standard format for cataloging and explaining data. From the very earliest, we saw archaic texts, to the very latest examples of Mesopotamian school curriculum. Yeah? Archaic periods right to these latest Greco-Babyloniaca that we see here. Now, the point of this talk is quite simple. This very efficient and relatively simple method of recording data in the form of explanatory lists and tables was not limited to Babylonian schools, but awareness of this system spread to other places and to other eras, even when cuneiform was no longer actively being used. It's important to be aware of the broader reaches of this Babylonian episteme as a corrective to this popular notion that after Alexander the Great, the entire world abandoned their own knowledge systems and turned to Greek science. Thank you very much.